I make the money, I make the rules, my husband David had said for the thousandth time, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who believed that economics determined hierarchy in every aspect of life. I was sitting at the kitchen table of the house he owned wearing clothes he'd approved of purchasing. Holding a check for $200, my weekly allowance, that he begrudgingly extended because apparently I needed discretionary funds for personal items. The thing he didn't know was that for the past 3 years, I'd been building something he couldn't control. The thing his lawyer would discover, 2 weeks after David filed for divorce demanding that I pay him alimony, was that I'd been very quiet about my net worth because I'd been waiting for the exact right moment to be very loud about it. 10 years of marriage had been 10 years of systematic financial erasure. I'd met David at 28. He was a successful investment banker, which meant he had significant income and significant opinions about how that income should be used. When we got married, I was working as a project manager for a tech company, making decent money, not as much as David, but a solid 6 figures. I'd worked my entire professional life to get to that position. I'd earned promotions. I'd built a reputation. I'd created something I was genuinely proud of. His first suggestion had been that I quit. "Why would you work if I make enough for both of us?" he'd asked one evening, and it had seemed reasonable at the time. Romantic, even. The idea that I didn't have to work. That I could finally relax and focus on being a wife and eventually a mother. That I could pursue my interests without the stress of corporate politics. What I hadn't understood was that quit working would eventually translate into have no income and then have no financial autonomy and finally have no identity outside of being David's wife. He'd cut me off completely. Not maliciously, as far as he was concerned. He'd given me access to a credit card for household expenses, but he'd review the statements and question purchases. He'd given me a $200 weekly allowance for personal items, discretionary money that he'd monitor and sometimes reduce if he thought I was being irresponsible. He'd paid for everything, the house, the cars, the vacations, and he'd made it very clear that this generosity came with strings attached. I couldn't make major decisions without his approval. I couldn't see my friends as often because he needed me available at home. I couldn't pursue my interests because they took time away from being his wife and eventually being his mother. And whenever I suggested that maybe I should go back to work, he'd remind me that his income was sufficient and that having me working would just be additional stress on him. "Your job is to manage the household and support my career," he'd say. "That's what I need from you. Not another job to worry about." By year 5, I'd lost my sense of self so completely that I couldn't remember what I'd wanted from life before marriage. I couldn't articulate my own opinions without checking his face first to see if they were acceptable. I'd learned to make myself smaller, quieter, less threatening to his authority. By year 7, I was deeply depressed and didn't even know it. I'd stopped calling my friends. I'd stopped taking classes. I'd stopped applying for jobs or thinking about my career. I'd become exactly what he wanted, a wife who existed primarily to support his life. By year 9, something had started to shift. Subtle at first. He'd started mentioning that maybe I'd gotten lazy or dependent. He'd compare me unfavorably to his colleagues' wives, who apparently maintained better figures or decorated their homes more tastefully. He'd suggested that perhaps my lack of income made me less valuable to the relationship. He'd started staying late at work more often. He'd started talking about needing space. By year 10, I could see the direction this was heading. The moment of clarity had come on a Tuesday in March, exactly 10 years and 2 weeks into our marriage. David had come home from work furious about something entirely unrelated to me, a deal that had fallen through, a colleague who'd gotten a promotion he'd wanted. And he'd taken it out on me anyway. He'd criticized my cooking, my appearance, my lack of productivity around the house despite the fact that I'd spent the entire day cleaning. He'd mentioned, almost casually, that he was considering taking a second mortgage out on the house without my input because the investment opportunity was too good to pass up. And something had broken in me. Not the kind of breaking that makes you collapse. The kind that makes you crystalline. Clear. Absolutely certain about what needs to happen. I was going to leave. I was going to rebuild my life. And I was going to do it without his permission or his approval. The problem was that by financial law, I was entitled to half of what we'd accumulated during our marriage. But David had accumulated everything in his name. The house was in his name. The investment accounts were in his name. The retirement accounts were in his name. The cars were in his name. And I had zero financial leverage because I had zero financial resources. I had a $200 weekly allowance and no job. So I'd gotten quiet and gotten strategic. I'd scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney first. Just to understand my options. I'd used a library computer and had the attorney's office send everything to my mother's email address. I needed to understand what I was entitled to, what the process would look like, and what the realistic timeline would be. That attorney had been very clear: without documented income or assets of your own, you'll need to prove what your contributions were worth during the marriage. Childcare, household management, emotional labor. But honestly, the documentation will be weak. Your best leverage is that you have no other way to support yourself. You'll likely receive alimony. But the amount will be based on his income, not on what seems fair. I'd left that meeting understanding that I needed leverage. Real leverage. Which meant I needed to show that I wasn't as helpless as I appeared. So I'd opened a bank account at a different institution. Just my social security number. Just my name. No one else's. And then I'd done something my mother had taught me years ago. Before I married and lost myself, I started making money in ways that David couldn't track. I'd reached out to former colleagues. People I'd worked with before I'd quit. I'd explained that I was interested in doing some freelance project management consulting. Nothing full-time. Just occasional projects. I'd charged my rate, which was higher than what I'd made working full-time, because I was more experienced now, and I deposited every single payment directly into my hidden account. I'd been very careful about it. I'd used a VPN when checking the account. I'd checked it from the library, never from home. I had the statement sent to a P.O. box that I rented under my mother's name. I'd told nobody. Not my mother, not my closest friends, not anyone. Because I'd learned, during 10 years of marriage, that information was power, and power could be used against you. For 3 years, while David continued to give me a $200 weekly allowance like I was a child with an allowance, I'd been accumulating wealth. I'd worked quietly on client projects. I'd managed implementations. I'd consulted on complex systems. I'd built infrastructure that companies depended on. And I'd gotten paid exceptionally well for it. By the time David filed for divorce, which he did on a Wednesday in March, exactly 3 years after my moment of clarity, I had $847,000 in that account. The mediation meeting had taken place in a conference room with beige walls and fluorescent lighting and the kind of energy that comes from people trying to decide who gets what when a life together is being divided into spreadsheets. David's lawyer had been confident. He'd been a man in his 60s who'd probably done this 1,000 times before. He'd probably seen every variation of divorce. And he'd probably never met a woman who'd been smart enough to plan this quietly. Your wife has no income, the attorney had said, sliding a document across the table. She hasn't worked in over a decade. By law, you're entitled to spousal support. Alimony. She's going to owe you. The judge will see that you've been the sole earner. That you've supported her entirely. That's clear grounds for support in your favor. David had smiled. He'd actually smiled. Like he'd won something. Like the idea of his wife owing him money had validated something fundamental about his worldview, that without his resources, I was worthless. That the only valuable thing I'd ever contributed was my loyalty and my presence. My lawyer, a woman named Patricia who'd been practicing family law for 30 years. And who I'd hired specifically because she'd grown tired of seeing women like me get destroyed in divorce proceedings, had remained completely calm. My client does have income, Patricia had said quietly, pulling out a folder. And significant assets. I'll be providing documentation of her consulting business, which has generated $847,000 over the past 3 years. She has a separate bank account with those funds. She's been working independently while your client was under the impression she was unemployed. I'd suggest we recalculate the alimony situation based on this new information. Patricia had slid across bank statements, consulting contracts, invoices, email correspondence with clients, documentation of every penny that I'd earned and deposited quietly into my hidden account. The room had gone silent. David's face had cycled through confusion, then anger, then something like panic. That's fraud, his lawyer had sputtered. Hidden assets. Undisclosed income. That's illegal. No, Patricia had replied calmly, almost gently. Those are the client's personal earnings from legitimate consulting work. She earned that money through her own labor and expertise. It's hers. The fact that your client didn't know about it doesn't make it fraud, it makes it privacy. Which is her right. She was not under any legal obligation to disclose income that was earned during the marriage from work performed independently. The divorce proceedings had changed dramatically after that revelation. Instead of me owing David alimony, we were looking at a much more equitable split. I was entitled to half of everything we'd accumulated during the marriage. My consulting income was my own. My $847,000 were undeniably my own. And more importantly, I had leverage. I had agency. I had options. Because now David understood that I wasn't as helpless as he'd assumed. That I'd been planning my exit for years. That I had resources and I had will and I was actually leaving. That I didn't need his permission or his approval to rebuild my life. David had tried to negotiate. He'd offered to reconcile. He'd suggested that maybe we'd made a mistake, that we could work through this, that I didn't understand the stress he was under. He'd tried to manipulate me the way he always had. But I'd spent 3 years preparing. I'd spent 3 years quietly building my own foundation. And now I was standing on solid ground. I want the house, I'd told Patricia. The house had appreciated significantly. It was worth $2.1 million. David had about $1.8 million in equity. By law, I was entitled to half of that appreciation, roughly $450,000 from the equity built during our marriage. But the house meant something to me beyond its financial value. It was where I'd spent 10 years. It was where I'd lost myself and where I was going to find myself again. We can negotiate for the house, Patricia had said. But you'll need to give up other assets to make the math work. So that's what I'd done. I'd taken the house. I'd taken my consulting income. I'd taken my freedom. And I'd let David have the investment accounts and the retirement money and everything else that represented his version of success. The divorce had been finalized exactly 18 months after David filed. The moment the judge signed the papers, I'd felt something I hadn't felt in a decade: possibility. I'd stayed in the house for exactly 2 weeks. Just long enough to understand what it felt like to be alone in it. To not be waiting for David to come home and critique me. To not be calculating whether the house was clean enough or if I'd made the right meal. To not be living in constant anticipation of saying the wrong thing. Then I'd listed it for sale. It had sold within 30 days for $2.3 million. I'd paid off the remaining mortgage and walked away with $1.2 million in liquid assets. Combined with my consulting income and my accumulated savings, I had approximately $2.1 million. I was 42 years old. I was starting over. I was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. 5 years later, I'd rebuilt my life in ways I couldn't have imagined during those 10 years of financial control. I'd turned my consulting business into a full company. I'd hired other project managers, systematized the processes, and scaled it to generating $8 million in annual revenue. I'd started a nonprofit dedicated to helping women exit financially controlling relationships, providing legal resources, financial planning guidance, and emotional support to people trying to escape what I'd experienced. I'd bought a new house. Not the old one, I'd sold that because it belonged to my marriage. A smaller one, that I'd chosen because it made me happy, not because it impressed anyone or proved anything to David. I'd traveled to places I'd always wanted to go. I'd taken classes in subjects I was curious about. I'd gone back to school and gotten my MBA. I'd dated people who respected me and my autonomy. I'd become friends with people who actually liked me instead of people who were friends with David's wife. I'd gotten therapy. I'd processed the 10 years of financial control and emotional manipulation. I'd learned to recognize unhealthy dynamics before they became embedded in my relationships. I'd rebuilt my sense of self with intention and care. David had tried to reach out once, about 3 years into my new life. He'd seen something about my company in a business publication. He'd wanted to reconnect. He'd mentioned that he missed me. He'd suggested that maybe we'd made a mistake, that maybe we could try again. I'd politely declined. "I'm glad you're reaching out," I'd said in the email I'd sent back. "I hope you've learned something from this experience. But I'm not interested in reconciliation. I'm interested in living my life. I wish you well." The real victory wasn't the money. It was understanding something fundamental about myself. I'd spent 10 years believing I needed David's permission to be valuable. I believed that without his income and his approval, I didn't matter. And it turned out that was completely wrong. The quiet years of building, the secret bank account, the hidden consulting work, the research into legal rights, the careful planning, those years hadn't been about proving David wrong. They'd been about proving myself right. I'd known, somewhere deep inside, that I was capable of more. That I was worth more. That I deserved better than to be dependent on someone who treated my value as conditional on my usefulness. I just had to get quiet enough to listen to that voice. And brave enough to act on it. By the time David figured out that his wife had resources and agency, I'd already figured out that I didn't need him anymore. I'd learned that the most powerful position isn't having money. It's knowing you can survive without someone who's been controlling you. It's understanding that your value doesn't come from someone else's approval. That's leverage. That's freedom. And that's something no amount of money could have taught me while I was still in that marriage.